The scalpel had been switched. The moment the rusty shard of metal sliced through the hepatic artery, blood sprayed up onto the surgical light. His life began to fracture right then, crumbling piece by piece, falling away for 5 full years. 5 years later he came back, not with a scalpel in his hand, but with the medical records of 4 people. When Gu Zhengjun picked up that scalpel, the sensation at his fingertips made him pause for half a second. It wasn't the smooth, cold resistance you'd expect from 316L surgical stainless steel. It was rough, a tepid kind of drag, like touching a piece of scrap iron that had been soaking in the rain for 3 days. He turned the blade over, edge up, and examined it under the operating light. Dark red rust spread along the cutting edge, not surface spots but deep pitting. The corrosion had worked its way into the crystal lattice of the metal. A blade like that couldn't cut through skin, couldn't even slice a sheet of printer paper. He set the knife down. His voice was perfectly level. "Get me another one." The scrub nurse Lin Xiaoyu froze for a second. She fumbled through the instrument tray, her fingers trembling, a thin film of sweat beading on her forehead. She'd been a scrub nurse for 6 years, had assisted on over 1,000 surgeries, and had never once made a mistake like this on the table. She rifled through the entire tray, picked up every blade and inspected it, confirmed every other knife was normal, and then looked up at Gu Zhengjun. Above the edge of her surgical mask, her eyes had already gone red. Gu Zhengjun took the second scalpel. Normal. He made the incision into the patient's abdominal cavity, and blood surged out. Not the slow, dark seepage of venous blood, but the bright red jet of a ruptured artery. Pressure so high it hit the surgical light, leaving drops of blood trailing down the white bulb. Within 3 seconds he located the source, an irregular tear in the hepatic artery. The wound edges weren't the clean incision of a scalpel. It looked more like the vessel had been punctured and ripped by something blunt. The moment his finger pressed down on it, his mind was already racing. The vessel wall felt wrong, too fragile, brittle in a way a normal hepatic artery shouldn't be, as if something had corroded it from the inside. The muscular layer and elastic fibers had lost all their integrity and resilience. Every time he placed a suture, the tissue tore, like trying to sew a piece of rice paper that had been soaked to pulp. He switched to the finest atraumatic suture, a smaller curved needle, and stitched one throw at a time. His fingers were as steady as a robotic arm, every stitch spaced with millimeter precision. On the monitor the blood pressure curve kept falling, and the anesthesiologist called out numbers that dropped lower each time: systolic 80, 60, 40. He didn't stop. He kept suturing until the final stitch through the knot cut the thread. The moment the scissors closed, the waveform on the monitor had already gone flat. He looked up at the clock on the wall. 2:17 a.m. The operating room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the central air conditioning, a low, steady drone, like the compressor of a morgue cooler running. The anesthesiologist stopped squeezing the bag. The alarm on the monitor had been silenced. Lin Xiaoyu stood at the instrument table, her mask soaked through, tears running down the edges and dripping onto the stainless steel tray, mixing with the residual blood on the instruments. Gu Zhengjun peeled off his gloves and signed the operative record. His handwriting was no different from usual, steady, clear, every stroke intact and forceful. He pushed open the hors doors, and the fluorescent lights in the corridor made him squint. The patient's family was sitting on the hallway bench. A thin woman in a faded floral blouse, one sleeve button missing and replaced with a safety pin. On her feet were those 15 yuan plastic sandals from the open-air market, the soles worn so thin you'd feel the temperature of the ground with every step. She held a canvas bag in her arms, filled with a change of clothes for her husband and 2 towels. The towels were new, tags still on. She'd bought them that afternoon at the supermarket, the most expensive one she could find. Behind her stood a tall, skinny boy. His school uniform sleeves were too short, exposing a wrist with an old scar faded to a pale white line. His eyes were exactly like his father's, deep-set, the whites very clear. He was holding an insulated food container wrapped in a towel because his mother had been afraid the soup would get cold. Gu Zhengjun walked up to them. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway. Every step felt like it landed on his own heartbeat. When the woman looked up at him, he'd seen that expression too many times before, the particular look of a patient's family waiting outside an hour. Hope and terror and pleading and despair all compressed into a single instant, like an overexposed photograph. He opened his mouth and said the words he hated most in the world but had spoken more than any others. "I'm sorry." The woman's body swayed. Not a theatrical faint, but a tremor that seemed to come from deep inside her soul, traveling from her feet to the crown of her head. She looked like a tree being uprooted. She rocked but she didn't fall. The canvas bag dropped from her arms. Towels and clothes spilled out. A dark blue pair of long underwear caught on the wheel of a stretcher parked outside the resuscitation room, the pant leg trailing on the floor and gathering a thin layer of dust. She didn't bend to pick it up. She just stood there staring at Gu Zhengjun, her mouth opening and closing. A sound caught in her throat like an animal with its neck gripped, taking its last breath. Her son crouched down and gathered everything back into the bag, one piece at a time. His movements were slow, his head down so his face couldn't be seen. He hugged the canvas bag to his chest and reached out with his other hand to hold his mother's. The old white scar on the back of his hand caught the fluorescent light. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just took his mother's hand, set the insulated food container down on the hallway bench, and then turned and walked away, pulling his mother step by step toward the end of the corridor. Their pace wasn't fast, but every step was steady. The container stayed on the bench, the radish and spare rib soup inside still steaming. Gu Zhengjun stood in the hallway watching the wisp of steam slowly dissolve into the cold early morning air. The patient's name was Zhao Changhe, 43 years old, a dock worker, end-stage cirrhosis complicated by liver cancer. He'd hauled cargo on the docks for 20 years, from breakbulk ships to container ships, the calluses on his shoulders thick enough to grind down a file. His wife's name was Zhang Xiaoa. She washed dishes in the dock canteen. Together they made less than 6,000 yuan a month, and they were putting their son through school. The day they discovered the liver cancer, Zhao Changhe had been on the dock hauling a 100-pound sack of fertilizer when he felt a pain in his right side. He thought it was a cramp, sat down for 10 minutes, drank some water and then hauled 3 more sacks. That evening the pain was so bad he couldn't straighten his back. Zhang Xiaoa forced him to go to the county hospital for an ultrasound. The doctor said there was a shadow on his liver, and told them to go to Shanghai. They took an overnight hard-seat train to Shanghai and spent 3 days lining up for an appointment with Gu Zhengjuan's specialist clinic. Zhang Xiaoa sold the family's ancestral homestead and scraped together 120,000 yuan. It was the house where 3 generations had lived, the mud wall still bearing the crooked characters of Zhao Changhe's name carved when he was 7. The day the house was sold, Zhao Changhe didn't go. He stood at the edge of the dock, watching the muddy Yangtze flow east, smoking one cigarette after another until the pack was empty. He crushed it, threw it into the river, then turned around and went to the bank to deposit the money into the hospital account. Zhang Xiaoa knelt on the floor of Gu Zhengjuan's consultation room, begging him to save her husband. Her hands were as cold as the stainless steel tray in the operating room. The sound of her knees hitting the tile was dull, like a torn drumskin. Gu Zhengjun helped her up and said, "I'll do everything I can." And he meant it. But that rusted scalpel had never intended to let him succeed. 3 days later, the hospital's Medical Incident Investigation Committee held its first meeting. The conference room air conditioning was cranked so low someone had draped a jacket over their shoulders. Gu Zhengjun sat at the far end of the table, a glass of plain water untouched in front of him. His mentor, the chief of hepatobiliary surgery Meng Xianting, sat at the opposite end, 7 or 8 people between them. The long table was covered in dark green felt. In front of each person lay a photocopied patient chart and surgical record, the cover stamped with red internal document seals. Meng Xianting flipped through 2 pages of the chart, set it down, took off his reading glasses and wiped them, then put them back on. His movements were very slow, so slow that everyone in the room had no choice but to wait for him. Then he looked up at Gu Zhengjun and spoke the first words of the entire meeting. "Zhengjun, tell me the truth. Had you been drinking before that surgery?" His tone was gentle as a teacher asking a student whether he'd eaten breakfast. Gu Zhengjun looked into Meng Xianting's eyes. He had looked into those eyes for 12 years. From the first time he saw them on the day of his graduate school interview, to the approving glances those eyes shot him over surgical masks during his residency, to the way they'd crinkled at the corners during his defense for promotion to associate chief physician. He had seen approval in those eyes, sternness, disappointment, pride. But he had never seen what he saw now. A carefully calculated concern. A composure that already knew the answer and was only asking for form's sake. He answered. No, his voice wasn't loud, but every word was crisp and clear, like the clean, emotionless cut of a scalpel through skin. Meng Xianting sighed. It was a very soft sigh, almost inaudible, but Gu Zhengjun heard it. He took off his reading glasses and laid them on top of the chart. The arms of the glasses made a faint rustling sound against the paper. He did not ask again. The head of the medical administration department sitting next to him began reading the preliminary investigation report. The report was long, thick with administrative jargon and legal clauses, wrapping what had happened in that operating room into a watertight bureaucratic document. It determined that the surgical instrument pack had been sealed 24 hours before the operation, the seal intact, and had undergone double verification by scrub nurse Lin Xiaoyu and the Central Sterile Supply Department. All instruments had met aseptic surgical standards. During the postoperative count, a rust-covered piece of metal of unknown origin had been found in the pack. The report classified the rusted blade as postoperative contamination and recommended improvements to instrument management protocols. As for the cause of the patient's death, the report preliminarily concluded it was intraoperative operator error leading to hepatic artery injury, resulting in secondary hemorrhagic shock. The words operator error landed on Gu Zhengjuan's head like a weight. He didn't move. He stared at that report, read every word from the first line to the last, and then asked a single question. Was the carbon tetrachloride residue on the rusted blade tested? The conference room went silent for 5 full seconds. This wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that gets punctured, the way the alarm on a monitor suddenly stops and everyone waits for the next sound. The medical administration chief's mouth opened and closed, and then he finally pushed out the words that snapped the last thread in Gu Zhengjuan's mind. It wasn't sent for testing. Gu Zhengjun said nothing more. He already knew the answer. Carbon tetrachloride is a key component in industrial cleaning solvents. Once it enters the bloodstream, it binds with plasma proteins to form highly toxic intermediates, triggering disseminated intravascular coagulation within seconds. The patient's systemic coagulation function drops to 0 in an instant, and any vascular injury becomes uncontrollable massive hemorrhage. This was not a question of surgical technique. It had nothing to do with surgical technique. This was murder. But if the rusted blade was never tested, the words chemical residue would never exist. There would never be a distinction between homicide and accident. There would only ever be operator error and license revoked. The whole logical chain was spotless, as clean as a sterilized scalpel. His junior colleague Song Huijin sat to Meng Xianting's right. He didn't say a single word the entire meeting. His eyes stayed fixed on the meeting minutes notebook in front of him, and his pen hadn't stopped moving since the meeting began, as though he were taking especially diligent notes. When the investigation team interviewed him, he said that Dr. Gu really hadn't seemed quite himself that day, that his hands had been shaking during pre-op prep. When they asked if he had smelled alcohol, he hesitated, then said maybe a little. Then he added, probably just stress. My senior colleague has always pushed himself very hard. The way he said it carried just the right note of regret and sympathy, like a junior colleague who truly cared about his senior. Those words were transcribed verbatim into the investigation report, appended below his witness signature. His signature was beautiful. The 3 characters of Song Huijin written with sweeping flamboyant strokes, the last stroke of each flicking upward, like 3 scalpels hanging upside down. His fiancée, Zhou Wanjing, did not attend the meeting and did not accept an interview with the investigation team. That afternoon she sent Gu Zhengjun a text message. For characters, we're breaking up. No punctuation, no salutation, no signature. As clean as a pathology report. When Gu Zhengjun received the message, he was standing next to the dumpster behind the hospital's rear exit. He watched as a cleaner pulled his belongings one by one out of his locker. His white coat, stethoscope, a worn-out surgical atlas, a stainless steel thermos with his name engraved on the lid. He picked his white coat out of the trash bag, shook off the cigarette ash, folded it neatly, and put it into a canvas bag. Then he heard footsteps behind him. It was Song Huijin. He was wearing the white coat with hepatobiliary surgery, embroidered on the chest, 2 pins in the pocket, one red and one blue. He'd come straight from the ore. The cuffs of his coat still had a few yellow splashes of iodine, and one side of his mask strap had come loose and was dangling by his ear. He walked up beside Gu Zhengjun and also looked toward the dumpster. The two of them stood side by side, a little over a meter apart. Wind blew through, rattling the plastic bags in the trash station. A stray cat bolted from behind a bin, leaped onto the wall, and disappeared over the rooftop across the way. Song Huijin spoke first. "Senior, I'll look after the ore for you." His voice was very soft, as if he were mentioning something trivial. Gu Zhengjun didn't answer, didn't look at him. He zipped up his canvas bag, picked it up, turned and walked into the rain in the back alley of the hospital. Behind him came Song Huijin's voice, muffled by the curtain of rain. "And sister-in-law, I'll take care of her for you." Gu Zhengjuan's stride hitched for a beat. Rainwater streamed down his hair, past his eyebrows, the bridge of his nose, his chin, dripping onto the canvas bag and spreading a dark patch of moisture. He didn't look back. Song Huijin stood in place for a long time, until Gu Zhengjuan's back disappeared at the end of the alley. Then he turned and walked back into the hospital building, pushed open the door to the ore, straightened his mask in the mirror, and reached for the lead apron that still held the residual warmth of Gu Zhengjuan's body. On the cuff of his white coat was a small stain of dark blue ink, accidentally smeared there by Gu Zhengjun. It hadn't come out after several washes. Song Huijin looked at that ink stain, pulled open a drawer, found a pair of scissors, and cut the piece of fabric out along the cuff seam, then dropped it into the trash. The sound of the scissors closing echoed in the empty changing room. Gu Zhengjun rented a tin-roofed shack in an urban village, a rooftop add-on, for 280 yuan a month. In the summer the sun baked it all day, and it was 5 degrees hotter inside than out. In the winter the cold wind knifed through the gaps in the tin, and he'd still be frozen awake wrapped in 2 blankets, the tip of his nose forever icy, his breath a visible white fog in the dark. He got up at 6 every morning, rode his e-bike 3 kilometers to the delivery station for morning assembly, shouted slogans, posed for the check-in photo. The station manager was a chubby guy in his early 20s, surname Liu, black-framed glasses, thick Subei accent. He called Gu Zhengjun Old Gu. He told Old Gu to ride slower at his age, that fixing the e-bike was expensive if you crashed, and hospital bills were even worse. Gu Zhengjun said okay. He lived in that urban village for 2 years and 7 months. In those 2 years and 7 months, he worked for 3 different food delivery platforms, delivered over 4,000 orders, had 3 e-bikes stolen, and got beaten up twice. The first time was a rainy night. Rain had been coming down since dusk, getting heavier and heavier, the kind of rain windshield wipers couldn't clear. The delivery platform's lateness penalty algorithm was a joke in that kind of weather. He was nearly 20 minutes late. The customer was a guy in his 30s, white tank top, a green dragon tattooed on his arm, standing at the entrance to his apartment building, 2 cigarette butts already at his feet. Seeing Gu Zhengjun wobbling up on his e-bike, the guy flung his cigarette to the ground, walked up, and without a word slapped him across the face, knocking his helmet askew. Gu Zhengjun said sorry. The guy said, "What the hell good is sorry, what do I need cops for?" When he handed over the delivery, half the soup had spilled. The plastic bag had melted through in one spot, and the takeout container inside was deformed. The guy took one look, then smashed the entire order against Gu Zhengjuan's chest. Rice and vegetables splattered everywhere. The guy turned around and slammed the door. Gu Zhengjun crouched down, picked the rice and food off the ground piece by piece back into the plastic bag, threw it in the trash, wiped his hands, got on his e-bike, and went to deliver the next order. Rain pelted his face, washing the red imprint of that slap pale. The second time was at an intersection. He was waiting at a red light in the non-motorized vehicle lane when a BMW turned right without signaling and plowed straight into him, knocking him over. He scrambled up from the ground, his knee scraped open, blood running down his shin, a huge hole torn in the knee of his pants. The BMW driver rolled down his window and glanced at him. A man in his 40s, gold chain around his neck, a woman with heavy makeup in the passenger seat. He pulled 500 yuan bills out of his wallet, tossed them out the window and said, "Poor bastards are tough to kill." He hit the gas and was gone. The 500 yuan lay soaking in the rain. Gu Zhengjun fished the bills out, spread them flat one by one, and blotted the water off with a napkin. That was half a month's rent. The farthest delivery he ever made was over a dozen kilometers. By the time he arrived, the food was cold. The customer was an old woman living alone, down a deep alley, who had to brace herself against the wall to walk. Her hand shook when she opened the door. Her finger joints thick and deformed. Classic rheumatoid arthritis. She said, "Young man, you've worked hard." He stood in her doorway and smelled the sour odor of stale air mixed with the fragrance of an air freshener. The old woman fished a crumpled 5 yuan note from her pocket and pressed it on him, saying, "Take it, buy yourself a drink." He refused, but she stuffed it into his pocket anyway. After he went downstairs, he sat on the back of his e-bike for a long time. After that, every time he passed that street, he would bring the old woman a meal, paying for it himself. She asked his name and he said, "My surname is Gu." She said, "Little Gu, you have a kind face, you look like a scholar." He smiled, set the food on her table, cracked a window open a bit for ventilation, and took her accumulated trash bags downstairs with him. He brought her meals for over half a year, until one day he knocked and no one answered. He asked a neighbor and learned that her son had finally come to take her in. He'd heard it was because her condition had worsened, her legs hurt too much to walk, and she needed someone around to care for her. He stood in front of that closed door, still holding a hot takeout box. After a moment he hung the box on the doorknob and walked away. That was the last time he gave a customer a free meal. His medical license was revoked. His professional title was annulled. His papers were retracted. His name was scrubbed from every research project he'd ever participated in. Even graduate students dared not write, "Thank you to Dr. Gu Zhongjun," in their thesis acknowledgments anymore. His name became a joke in medical circles. That stupid surgeon who drank before operating and killed his patient. Someone posted online about how Gu Zhongjun used to have a terrible temper in the OR, yelling at nurses all the time, and that what happened was karma. Hundreds of replies piled on, saying people like that should have been purged from medicine long ago. He saw it. He didn't reply, didn't rebut. He set his phone on the table, unscrewed a bottle of water, and swallowed some fever reducers. He was burning up, nearly 40 degrees Celsius, curled on the fold-out bed in his tin shack, wrapped in 2 blankets and still shivering, his teeth chattering. The fever medicine was given to him by his neighbor, Lao Fong. Lao Fong was from Guizhou in his 40s, working on a nearby construction site tying rebar. He came back every day covered in dust, cement caked under his fingernails, the calluses on his hands hard enough to use as sandpaper. Passing by Gu Zhongjun's door after work, he noticed that this ordinarily quiet man hadn't been seen in 2 days. The door of the tin shack was bolted from the inside. He knocked a dozen times with no response, pressed his ear to the door, and heard a suspicious silence. When he finally jimmied the lock and got inside, he found Gu Zhongjun curled into a ball in the corner of the bed, body blazing hot. So hot that when Lao Fong touched his skin he jerked his hand back. He carried him downstairs, hailed a cab to the community clinic. 2 days on 4 fluids. It cost 286 yuan. Lao Fong paid it for him, pulling wrinkled bills out of his pants pocket. 10s, 20s, 50s, plus a couple of coins that dropped and rolled under the clinic bed. Lao Fong crouched down, picked up the coins, blew the dust off, and placed them on the nurse's payment counter. Later, Gu Zhongjun asked him why he'd saved him. Lao Fong said, "When you were unconscious you kept shouting suture. I figured a man shouting about sutures even in a coma probably isn't a bad guy." Gu Zhongjun stared at him for a long moment, then said, "Your teeth are loose. It's periodontitis. Let me take a look." Lao Fong opened his mouth, and the distinctive odor of years of betel nut chewing hit him. Gu Zhongjun shone a flashlight in and said it was heavy dental calculus pressing on the gums. He'd need a subgingival scaling. He found a fruit knife, sterilized it with alcohol, found a whetstone and dulled the blade. Then had Lao Fong sit on a stool, tilt his head back toward the window light. With that dulled fruit knife he spent nearly an hour scraping the calculus off the inner side of Lao Fong's lower front teeth. Piece by piece, each one black like broken seashells. Lao Fong's eyes watered from the pain, but he didn't move the entire time. When he was done, Gu Zhongjun told him to rinse with salt water for a few days and it would get better, and to eat less betel nut from now on. Lao Fong asked how he learned to do that. Gu Zhongjun said he'd picked it up during a rotation in stomatology. Lao Fong's eyes went wide. You're really a doctor? He nodded. Lao Fong was silent for a moment, then pulled 200 yuan out of his pocket. Then I owe you for the teeth cleaning. Gu Zhengjun pushed the money back into his pocket. I still owe you 286. He never forgot that 286 yuan. Later he paid Lao Fong back with interest. He helped Lao Fong take over the lease of a small hardware store back in his hometown, even lined up the supply chain and sales channels for him. When Lao Fong was naming the store, he called him and said, Dr. Gu, you're educated, help me think of a name. Gu Zhengjun said, just call it Zhengjun Hardware. Lao Fong said okay, and asked how to write Zhengjun. Over the phone, Gu Zhengjun taught him stroke by stroke like teaching a child how to write. After he hung up, he sat in the tin shack listening to the rain outside. And for 1 second his heart was quiet. That quiet was very light, like the steady, unhurried beep of a monitor in an oar. It had been a very long time since he'd heard that sound. In those long nights, he would sometimes sit alone on the fold-out bed in the tin shack, switch off the lights, and keep his eyes open in the darkness. The neighbor's television leaked through the thin partition, a primetime melodrama. The male lead holding the female lead in the rain shouting, "Don't leave me." Downstairs, people were playing mahjong, the tiles clacking together with a crisp, hollow sound, occasionally punctuated by a yell of pung or kong. A dog was barking deep in the alley. From the distant elevated highway came the low rumble of passing vehicles. He listened to all these sounds and remembered the operating light in the oar, the beeping of the cardiac monitor, the face of that dock worker, that rust-scarred scalpel. He told himself he would go back. Not to prove he was innocent, but to let those people know they had killed the wrong man. He was waiting for an opening. Came at the moment he least expected it. That night, after finishing his last delivery, he returned to the tin shack. It was past 1 a.m. He opened his old laptop, used for 5 years, the screen brightness not quite stable, flickering occasionally. In his encrypted email sat a new message. The sender was a name he'd never seen before, Dr. Amara Okonkwo. The body of the email was a single line of English. Cape Town, Lab 47, 3 kilometers underground. We have everything you need. Attached were a detailed inventory of lab equipment and an e-ticket to Cape Town. The equipment list ran several pages, each item annotated with brand, model, and technical specifications. The gene sequencer was Illumina's latest, the mass spectrometer top-of-the-line Thermo Fisher, the cell culture system equipped with fully automated temperature control and gas mixing modules, the biosafety cabinet meeting BSL-4 standards, and the animal facility outfitted with a full suite of equipment for primate housing and surgery. This lab's configuration could rival any national-level key laboratory, and in some respects was even more advanced. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of charity. It was a recruitment that had been prepared for a long time. He spent 3 hours going through that inventory item by item, from brand and model to technical specs, from the lab's climate control systems to its data security architecture. Every piece of equipment was top tier. Every detail had been considered. He closed the laptop and walked to the window of the tin shack. Outside was the nightscape of the urban village, neon lights turning the water on the pavement into a kaleidoscope of color, smoke from the barbecue stall wafting and carrying the scent of cumin and chili powder. In the distance, a high-rise was being topped off, the red warning light on the tower crane blinking on and off like the signal on a cardiac monitor. He fished a 50-cent coin out of his pocket, flipped it, caught it. Heads he'd go. Tails he wouldn't. The coin spun in the air a few times and landed in his palm. Heads. He put the coin back in his pocket and replied to that email with a single word: departing. He packed very little for the journey out of China. A few changes of clothes, an old pair of sneakers, a scalpel he'd used for many years. Not one of those disposable ones from the ore, but an old-style scalpel with a steel handle and replaceable blades, a gift from Meng Xianting back when he was a grad student. Engraved on the handle were 4 characters. The healer's heart is benevolent. The engraving was now worn nearly illegible. And one more thing. A specimen jar he'd secretly taken from the hospital archive. Zhao Chongha's liver pathology slide, preserved in formalin, sealed in a waterproof bag, wrapped in 5 layers of foam and stuffed into the deepest corner of his suitcase. He carried these things over 10,000 kilometers, from Shanghai to Dubai for a layover, then on to Cape Town. He arrived in the small hours. The South African summer was oppressively hot. the air thick with the smell of eucalyptus and dust, heat waves shimmering up from the tarmac and distorting the tail fins of distant aircraft into wavy lines. A black SUV with no license plates was waiting for him in the airport parking lot. The driver was a silent black woman, short hair, sunglasses, holding a placard with 47 written on it. She took his suitcase and put it in the trunk, opened the back door for him, and didn't say a single word the entire time. The car drove for nearly 5 hours. The view outside the window gradually changed from the city lights of Cape Town to desolate scrubland, and from scrubland to a stretch of barren hills. It finally stopped in front of an abandoned mine entrance in the middle of the desert. The entrance was an unremarkable corrugated iron shed. Push the door open, and inside was an elevator with only one button on the panel, B3. The descent was long. He could feel the pressure change in his eardrums. When the doors opened, a rush of cold air hit him, carrying that particular smell found only in high-level biosafety labs. A mixture of disinfectant, HEPA-filtered air and metal. Clean, cold, sterile. A black woman in a lab coat was waiting at the elevator. Short hair, rimless glasses, a tablet computer in her hand. In English with a strong South African accent, she spoke the first words. "Welcome to Lab 47, Dr. Gu. I'm Amara." Gu Zhengjun stepped out of the elevator and looked around. Both sides of the corridor were transparent glass walls, and the labs behind them were filled with every piece of equipment he'd seen on that inventory list, each one even newer than he'd imagined, many still with the protective film unpeeled. Amara walked ahead, talking as she went. Her pace was quick, her thoughts clearly organized. She obviously knew the place inside out. She led him down a long corridor and pushed open the door to the lab at the very end. The equipment inside was a little different from the rest. There was an old-style operating table, and the surgical light above it was somewhat dated, its housing held together with clear tape over a crack. Next to the table was a workbench with a microscope and some basic biochemical analysis equipment. It seemed slightly out of place with the overall aesthetic of the underground facility. Amara stopped at the door and didn't go any further in. "Dr. Gu," she said, "I've read every paper you ever published. Your piece on minimally invasive cardiac surgery in The Lancet. Your paper on liver regeneration factors in Nature Biotechnology. And the one that was retracted." She paused. "The retracted one I read 3 times. That wasn't academic misconduct. That was someone stealing from you." Gu Zhengjun didn't respond. She continued, 3 years ago, when I was a visiting scholar at the University of Cape Town, I read your paper on the mechanisms of vascular endothelial protection during cardiac surgery. That line of thinking inspired me, and I later used a similar approach to solve a problem that had been plaguing my lab for years. So I looked you up. I found your license had been revoked, your papers retracted, you were being cyberbullied across the entire internet back home. And then I spent a long time tracking down your contact information through an unremarkable little paper you published in an African journal. She paused again, pushed her glasses up her nose, and allowed a very faint smile. In the acknowledgments of that little paper, you wrote one line. "Thanks to all those who reached out a rope in the darkness. I saw it. I wanted to reach a rope out to you." Gu Zhengjun finally opened his mouth. His voice was a little hoarse, with the rustiness of someone who hadn't spoken English in conversation for far too long. "Why?" Amara said. "Because you deserve it." She turned and pointed to a lab across the corridor. "That one is yours. Full clearance. You can use any equipment here, do any research you want. I won't interfere with your direction, won't dictate your timeline. You don't need to publish papers. You don't need to apply for grants. I only have one condition." She looked at him. "Whatever you create, it has to be worthy of the paper that was stolen from you." Gu Zhengjun looked at her for a long time. Then he walked into the lab that belonged to him. He placed the specimen jar on the workbench, unscrewed the lid, and used a pair of forceps to carefully lift out Zhao Changhe's pathology slide. He placed it on the microscope stage and adjusted the focus. The cellular structures gradually sharpened in the eyepiece. The vascular endothelial cells corroded by carbon tetrachloride displayed a fragmented, irregular spongy architecture, with pycnotic nuclei, vacuolated cytoplasm, and elastic fibers snapped into short, broken segments. It was entirely different from the intact layered structure of normal hepatic artery tissue. This was ironclad proof. He straightened up, pulled an old notebook from the pocket of his lab coat, flipped to the first page, picked up a pen and began to write. Amara stood outside, watching him through the glass wall. She didn't go in to interrupt. She turned and walked quietly away, her rubber-soled shoes making almost no sound on the epoxy resin floor. Lab 47 had no windows, no sunrise or sunset, only the constant temperature and humidity of the HVAC system, and the cold white light from rows of LED tubes. Time here was compressed into a sequence of experimental protocols and data logs. Gu Zhongjun stayed in this place for 2 full years. In those 2 years he did not see the sun once. His skin grew pale and translucent, the veins on his arms clearly visible under the light. His sleep schedule inverted until he completely lost any sense of circadian rhythm. When he was tired, he collapsed onto the lab bench and slept for 2 hours. When he woke, he continued the experiment. When he was hungry, he ate a sandwich from the lab fridge. When he was thirsty, he drank purified water. He performed whole genome sequencing on Zhao Chongha's tissue sections, and used gene editing technology to reconstruct in vitro a cellular model of the hepatic artery that had been severed by that rusted scalpel. On the reconstructed model, he repeatedly simulated the conditions of that surgery, the concentration of carbon tetrachloride residue, the internal pressure of the hepatic artery, the mechanical parameters of surgical suturing. Every single simulation yielded the same result. Carbon tetrachloride entering the bloodstream binds with plasma proteins to form highly toxic intermediates, inducing widespread intravascular coagulation in an extremely short time. The collagen and elastic fibers of the vessel wall are severely damaged, and fragility skyrockets. The patient's uncontrollable massive hemorrhage during the operation was an inevitable outcome. No surgeon could have completed suturing under those conditions. He had accomplished the first objective, proving that the rusted scalpel was a murder weapon, not an accident. The second objective was much harder, but he completed it over countless sleepless stretches as well. He established an entirely new gene therapy system, named Shinnong. The underlying logic of this system was completely different from traditional liver regeneration factors. It didn't repair damage, it rebuilt function. Using a modified adeno-associated viral vector, it delivered an artificially designed gene sequence into the nucleus of liver cells, activating the liver's inherent regenerative program and enabling damaged liver tissue to rebuild itself in situ into functional hepatocytes. He tested it on a primate animal model. On the day the results came out, everyone in the lab gathered around Amara, her 2 postdocs, even researchers from the neighboring lab who came over to Rubberneck. The animal's liver had fully regenerated within 4 weeks. The newly formed liver tissue was indistinguishable from the original liver in structure, function, and metabolic levels. Amara held the experimental report, and when she finished flipping through the last page, she looked up at Gu Zhongjun. It took her a long moment to speak. "You just rewrote the textbook." Gu Zhongjun removed his safety goggles and rubbed his eyes, raw from the UV light. He didn't celebrate. He logged the final data point into his lab notebook, saved the files, and powered down the microscope. Then he did something that was strictly prohibited by lab rules. He took that 50-cent coin out of his pocket and placed it on the lab bench. The coin reflected a dull metallic sheen under the cold light. He had kept this coin all along, not as a memento of a decision, but to remind himself of something. His life had never been decided by the flip of a coin. That heads he threw had merely been the last excuse he gave himself, a reason to feel at peace boarding that flight to Cape Town. He took all the core data for the Shinnong system, several dozen international patents, the technology transfer agreement signed with Amara, and a complete plan for revenge, and boarded a flight back to China. Outside the airplane window, the South African desert shrank into a patch of ochre, then the blue of the Indian Ocean, then a layer of clouds. On the plane he closed his eyes and faces surfaced one by one in his mind: Meng Xianting, Song Huijin, Zhou Wanjing, Gu Jingchuan. Those people thought he was dead, dead at the bottom of society, dead in one rainy night after another delivering takeout. They had no idea he was more alive than he had ever been, and that he was about to return. Not to come back begging for justice. To come back to deliver a diagnosis. The name Gu Jingchuan had no direct relationship with Gu Zhongjun before the incident. Yet Gu Jingchuan happened to be Meng Xianting's son, taking his mother's surname. He was 3 years older than Gu Zhongjun. Not a doctor, but he had over a dozen holding companies under his name, controlling one of the largest private pharmaceutical conglomerates in the country, Tianheng Medical. Tianheng Medical's days had not been easy recently. Its core product lines were aging, generic drug profits were getting thinner by the day, volume-based procurement rounds kept slashing prices, and its R&D pipeline had dried up. The Hong Kong IPO was Gu Jingchuan's last lifeline, and the Rebirth project was the gold brick tied to that lifeline. Gu Zhengjun spent 3 months cross-referencing every email, every transfer record, every contract, nailing the timeline down to the exact day. The evidence he found included internal emails between Gu Jingchuan and Song Huijin, in which Song Huijin described in detail the process of stealing experimental data from Gu Zhangjuan's lab. The safe combination was Gu Zhangjuan's medical license number, and it took him only 3 tries to crack it. The access card swipe record showing Song Huijin entering Gu Zhangjuan's lab, time-stamped on a late weekend night 2 months before the incident, a time that completely contradicted Song Huijin's own claim that he was at home with my parents that day. A comparison table between the independently developed research data Gu Jingchuan showed to investment institutions and Gu Zhangjuan's original lab notebooks. Dozens of datasets were highly identical, right down to 3 identical decimal point errors in the control group. The compressed file of raw data Song Huijin sent to Gu Jingchuan and its timestamp, the file name even being Zhengjun Experimental Dataful Versioned zip. And there was something even more damning. The raw clinical data from Tianheng Medical's internal quality control system. The data clearly showed that in the Phase 2 clinical trial for the Rebirth project, the treatment group's effective rate was only 21.8%, 3 percentage points lower than the placebo group. Song Huijin personally approved the optimization plan for the data. In an internal email he wrote 4 characters. Change it until it passes. Then he took this optimized data and submitted it to the regulatory authority. All the evidence combined was enough to drag Tianheng Medical from the clouds back down to the ground and smash it to pieces. He didn't post any of this online, didn't sell it to the media, didn't hand it to the police. He was waiting for a stage. That stage was the Global Precision Medicine Summit. The summit was set to be held at the Shanghai International Convention Center. Tianheng Medical chose this venue for its final stop roadshow before the IPO because Gu Jingchuan wanted scale. The bigger the better. He booked the entire banquet hall, plastered Tianheng Medical's logo across every digital screen, and ordered custom gift bags printed with the Rebirth project insignia. Inside were Tianheng Medical brochures, a fountain pen engraved with Meng Xianting's name, and an exquisite keychain shaped like a DNA double helix. Invitations were sent to the most powerful people in the global healthcare industry. Nobel laureates, Asia-Pacific presidents of multinational pharmaceutical companies, heads of sovereign wealth funds, government officials. Reporters from Reuters and Bloomberg were there. The financial news channel was broadcasting live, and trending topics had been pre-purchased. At the private dinner the night before the roadshow, Gu Jingchuan got drunk. Standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Huangpu River nightscape, he raised his wine glass and said to the person beside him, an executive from a foreign investment bank, "By this time tomorrow, Tianheng will be the #1 stock in Chinese gene therapy." Gu Zhengjun chose to make his move on this day because he wanted the whole world to see those 3 characters. Gu Zhengjun. Not a small-scale clarification, not a lawyer's letter, not a statement published in an academic journal. He was going to rip off the cloth that had been covering everything for 5 years live in front of a global broadcast with all the investors, experts, and media watching. When Song Huijin stepped up to the podium to deliver his presentation, Gu Zhengjun was sitting at the far end of the very last row of the banquet hall. He wore a pair of rimless glasses, a tailored suit, his hair combed neatly. He had changed so much, thinner, cheekbones more prominent. His gaze shifted from gentle to icy, from bright to deep. No one recognized him. Even Zhou Wanjing walked right past him twice without realizing. Song Huijin's speech was drawing to a close. The 3D animation for the Rebirth project appeared on the massive screen, and the entire audience rose in a standing ovation. Gu Zhengjun did not applaud. He pulled out his phone and sent 2 words to Jiang Yan. "Do it." 3 seconds later, the giant screen went black. The entire room fell silent for 5 full seconds. This wasn't ordinary silence. It was the silence of hundreds of people collectively holding their breath, A silence in which the air itself seemed to solidify. Then the screen lit up again. A line of white text appeared on a black background. To all shareholders, investors, and partners of Tianheng Medical. The characters were clean and sharp, each one looking as if it had been carved with a scalpel. Gu Jingchuan's first reaction was that the control booth had malfunctioned. He whipped his head toward the control area. The operator was frantically pounding the keyboard, forehead drenched in sweat, the armpits of his shirt already soaked through. Gu Jingchuan grabbed his walkie-talkie and shouted, "Shut the screen off." Only static crackled back. None of the controls were responding. The entire building's display system had completely slipped out of their control. Mark Thompson pushed his way through the crowd. The former Marine in charge of security for the entire summit was built like a tank and stood a head taller than the people around him. He spoke into his chest mic. "Hold positions. Everyone stay where you are." His tone brooked no argument. The side doors of the banquet hall were pushed open from the outside. A few security personnel in black suits tried to rush in, but they were blocked by another team also in black suits. The two sides faced off at the door for a few seconds, then remained locked in a standoff. No one knew who these people were, or when they had managed to seize control of the entire building's security apparatus. Zhou Wanjing's smile froze on her face. Instinctively she reached for her phone. The screen lit up with a real-time push alert from the Bloomberg terminal. Breaking news. Tianheng Medical IPO suspended amid fraud allegations. Her hands started to shake. The nude pink gel on her nails reflected a false gloss under the lights. The text on the big screen vanished, replaced by a document. A patent certificate from the National Intellectual Property Administration. The patent title: an AAV vector-based gene therapy system for in situ liver regeneration. The application date was a full year and a half earlier than the date Tianheng Medical claimed to have independently developed the Rebirth project. Printed in the patent holder field were 3 characters. Gu Zhengjun. A ripple of sharp intakes of breath began to spread through the audience, a tide moving from the back rows to the front. Then came the second document, the internal emails between Gu Jingchuan and Song Huijin. Every line of the emails was magnified and projected across the entire wall. In the emails, Song Huijin described in detail the process of stealing experimental data from Gu Jingjuan's lab. The safe combination was the medical license number. He'd cracked it in 3 tries. The lab notebooks were on the bottom shelf of the safe, wrapped in a craft paper envelope labeled Liver Regeneration Factor, Preliminary Experimental Data. The last line of the email was highlighted in red and enlarged. "My senior colleague is too naive. He thought locking it in a safe would keep it secure." Song Huijin stood at the podium, still holding the remote clicker. His mouth opened and closed, his entire mandible seeming to hang unhinged and out of his control. Someone in the audience shot to their feet and pointed at his face, yelling, "Song Huijin, is what's in those emails true?" The remote slipped from his hand and hit the marble steps. The batteries popped out and bounced down step by step, rolling to a stop at the toe of a front-row investor's leather shoe. The third file popped up right after. The raw clinical data from Tianheng Medical's internal quality control system. The data was crystal clear. The treatment group's effective rate was only 21.8%, 3 percentage points lower than the placebo. The operation log for the data modification was completely restored. The operator ID pointed to Song Huijin. The operation time was in the early hours of the morning, 3 days before the data was submitted to the regulatory agency. The log showed he logged into the system, first exported the raw data spreadsheet, then used Excel to recalculate all the statistical indicators, and replace the entire dataset where significant differences existed. The entire operation lasted nearly 2 hours. He saved the modified file 3 times. Every single save left an indelible record in the system log. All the operational traces had been encrypted and forwarded in real time to a blockchain-based evidence preservation platform. The timestamps were immutable. The source of every frame, the time of capture, and the logic of the comparison were all clearly displayed in a sidebar for everyone to see. Then came the fourth piece of evidence. An audio file. When it played, what came through was an older man's voice, with a thick Jiangsu accent, speaking each word unhurriedly, like a teacher giving a small seminar. "Jingchuan, have you secured all of Zhengjuan's data? You must get that lab notebook. It cannot remain at the hospital." I trust little Song to handle things, but Zhang Jun is too smart. If he ever figures things out one day, that data will be his weapon. Once you get it, destroy the man. Make sure he can never turn things around. In the background were the crisp sounds of tea things clinking and the faint strains of a guqin. The tune was High Mountains Flowing Water. The timestamp on this recording was less than 2 months before Gu Zhangjuan's downfall. The location was the study of Meng Xianting's home, a study crammed with antique books and calligraphy scrolls, on the wall hanging 4 large characters brushed by Meng Xianting himself. Great physician, utmost sincerity. When the audio finished playing, the screen switched to a live feed. The feed showed the headquarters building of the Chinese Medical Association in Beijing. Meng Xianting was seated at the head table, chairing a review meeting for the election of new members to the Academy of Engineering. He wore a dark gray Zhongshan suit, a national emblem pin on his chest. The nameplate in front of him read Review Committee Chair, in large gilded characters. He was in the middle of reading the review criteria aloud. Right as he read the line, academic integrity is the first standard in the selection of academicians, someone in the audience stood up, holding a phone high and shouting a question. Meng Xianting raised his head and took off his reading glasses. He saw the man holding the phone, a senior colleague he had known for 30 years. The man's hand was shaking violently. The phone screen was playing the recording of what Meng Xianting had said in his own study, on a loop. Meng Xianting stood up. His body swayed twice. He reached out to steady himself on the nameplate, but his fingers instead knocked over his thermos. Tea spilled out and rapidly soaked into the red official document, the dark brown stain blotting out the 3 characters for review criteria. He didn't wipe it. He just stood there, looking out at the hundreds of pairs of eyes below him. His mouth opened and closed, and a muffled, strangled rasp came from his throat. Then his whole body pitched backward. The back of his head struck the steel frame of the backdrop with a sickening thud. The slogan for this year's review meeting was printed on the backdrop: possessing both ability and integrity, with integrity first. His body slid slowly down those 8 large characters. The collar of his Zhongshan suit skewed to one side. The national emblem pin fell off his chest, hit the floor, bounced once and rolled under the conference table. No one went to pick it up. At the same moment, Gu Jingchuan had bolted up from his seat. His motion was so violent his thigh knocked over the water bottle in front of him, spilling water onto the pants of the investor next to him. The man yelped, but Gu Jingchuan didn't even hear it. He charged for the fire exit, his leather shoes hammering frantically on the concrete stairs, the echoes ringing through the entire stairwell. He ran down 14 flights, burst into the underground parking garage, and pulled out his car keys to unlock the Mercedes S-Class. It took 3 tries for his finger to hit the right button. The headlights flashed twice. The moment he yanked the car door open, he saw someone sitting in the driver's seat. A black woman, short hair, rimless glasses, gray suit, holding a tablet computer with a video call in progress. On the screen was the face of Dr. Amara, with the wall of patent certificates in Lab 47 behind her. She smiled. "Good evening, Mr. Gu. Your plane has been grounded." Gu Jingchuan stumbled backward and spun around to run. 2 security personnel in black suits emerged from the elevator lobby. Behind them was Kong Xiaohe, gold-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, holding a freeze order affixed with the court's official seal. He extended the order toward Gu Jingchuan, his tone as flat as if commenting on the weather. "Mr. Gu, your shares in Tianjin Medical, all offshore accounts, properties in Shanghai and Beijing, as well as the private jet parked at the Pudong Airport FBO, were all legally frozen 5 minutes ago. Total frozen amount, including your 17 SPVs in the Cayman Islands, converted, is approximately 4.2 billion yuan. Gu Jingchuan didn't take the document. He stood on the concrete floor of the parking garage, staring at his own shadow shrunk into a small puddle under the fluorescent lights. Then the right side of his face suddenly started to twitch. The corner of his mouth drooped uncontrollably. His right eyelid rapidly sagged. He was rushed to Huashan Hospital and diagnosed with an acute ischemic stroke, moderate to severe on the NIHSS. In the resuscitation bay, he lay on the gurney, the entire right side of his body completely unresponsive. His left hand clawed desperately at the bed rail, nails scraping harsh white streaks into the metal. His phone had fallen to the floor. The screen still lit up with a Bloomberg terminal alert, Tianheng Medical IPO officially withdrawn. Zhou Wanjing didn't run. Reporters swarmed her, flashbulbs bleaching her face a ghastly white. Someone asked if she knew about the data fraud. She didn't answer. Did she know the lab notebooks were stolen? She didn't answer. Was her breaking up with Gu Zhengjun connected to any of this? She finally lifted her head. Her lips moved. I was pregnant with his child. The entire crowd went silent for a beat, then erupted into an even greater furor. She didn't say anything else. She stood, pushed through the journalists, walked into the women's restroom and locked the door. From the inner pocket of her LV handbag, she pulled out a pill bottle, sleeping pills. She had prepared them in advance, kept pressed beneath her phone, powder compact and car keys. She unscrewed her water bottle and swallowed all the pills. While waiting for the drugs to take effect, she took out the Chanel Cocoa lipstick from her makeup bag and wrote a paragraph on the mirror. The color was true red. Written on the glass, it looked like a wound composed of words. 20 minutes later, security broke down the door. She was taken to Ruijin Hospital for gastric lavage. The rescue was successful. When she woke, the first thing she said to her lawyer was, "I didn't help him steal the data. I just didn't stop him from stealing the data." The lawyer wrote the sentence down in his notepad, and then told her that legally the difference between those two things was very small. Song Huijin was the last one to leave the banquet hall. He was escorted by police through the empty corridor, past the scattered gift bags and the crushed DNA double helix keychains. His lawyer followed behind, walking and making phone calls, voice kept low, only snatches of words audible. Plea attitude. Sentencing recommendation. Life imprisonment. Before being shoved into the police car, Song Huijin turned his head to look back at the glass curtain wall of the International Convention Center. The wall reflected his silhouette. Suit wrinkled, tie askew, the handcuffs glinting coldly under the fluorescent light. He seemed to remember something and suddenly spoke to the officer beside him. "My senior colleague taught me how to hold a scalpel. He taught me very well. I'm the one who didn't learn." When Gu Zhengjun received all this news, he was sitting in the Starbucks directly across from the International Convention Center. A cup of Americano, long gone cold, sat in front of him. His phone screen scrolled with a cascade of messages. Jiang Yan sent a screenshot of the short-selling profits, the numbers still jumping as fast as her keystrokes. Kong Xiaohe sent confirmation of the asset freezes, each one followed by a green execution complete tag. Amara sent a voice message, saying in English that the real-time assets under management for the Tianquan Capital Fund had just broken past a certain figure. He finished reading the messages, turned his phone screen down on the table, and picked up that cold Americano for a sip. The coffee was bitter to the point of being acrid. He hadn't added any sugar. Kong Xiaohe called from the parking garage, his voice lowered. "Gu Jingchuan is at Huashan Hospital. They just finished the thrombectomy. He's not going to die, but he's got facial paralysis. Doctors say at least 6 months of recovery, and full recovery depends on how rehab goes." Gu Zhengjun said, "Tell the doctors to use the best thrombolytic available. You want to save him? He's a patient." Gu Zhengjun set the coffee cup down and tapped the rim absently with his finger. "I'm a doctor. Even if he once tried to kill me." Kong Xiaohe was silent on the other end for a moment, then said, "Do you know who you sound like right now?" Gu Zhengjun didn't ask. Kong Xiaohe answered for him. "You sound like a real doctor." Then he hung up. Gu Zhengjun pulled out the Shenong System Global Multi-Center Clinical Trial Protocol from his briefcase and set it on the plastic tabletop. The first page listed the primary inclusion criteria: patients with end-stage liver disease, in economic hardship, unable to afford existing treatment options. Enrollment free of charge. Drug product provided at no cost by the Defu Liver Regeneration Research Center. Intellectual property permanently royalty-free for public health institutions in developing countries worldwide. He signed his name on the last page. The handwriting was exactly the same as it had been when he'd signed that operative record 5 years ago. Steady, clear, every stroke intact and forceful. Then he put the document back into his briefcase, pushed open the glass door of the Starbucks, and stepped into the night. Across the street, the police cars in front of the convention center were still flashing red and blue. Reporters were doing live stand-ups with their cameras and boom mics. He didn't spare them more than a glance. He turned and walked into the convenience store next door. He bought a bottle of water and a box of Band-Aids. The Band-Aids were for the blister on his heel, rubbed raw by the new leather shoes he'd worn today. He put the Band-Aids on, then pulled his old sneakers out of the plastic bag and changed into them, tying the laces. The soles of the old sneakers were worn extremely thin. There was a grease stain on the vamp he'd never been able to wash out, splashed there by a spilled container of spicy hot pot broth back in his delivery days. He stood at the doorway for a moment in those shoes. The night wind blew in from the direction of the Huangpu, carrying the scent of water and the cool damp of early autumn, tousling his hair. He picked up the plastic bag and walked toward the metro station. Passing a bus stop, he saw the giant poster for Tianheng Medical's Rebirth Project still hanging on the billboard. On the poster, Song Huijin stood in a white coat, arms folded across his chest, a golden DNA double helix behind him. Someone had stuck a yellow post-it note to the bottom right corner of the poster. Written on it in marker were two words, fraud. 2 months later, the trial opened at the Shanghai No. 1 Intermediate People's Court. Song Huijin sat in the defendant's chair, wearing the blue vest of the detention center, his hair shaved close to the scalp, showing a pale bluish-white skin beneath. He had been trembling from the moment the bailiffs brought him in, shaking so hard the whole chair vibrated faintly, his handcuffs clinking against the metal armrests. The prosecutor read the indictment: theft of trade secrets, fabrication of clinical data, perjury, accessory to intentional homicide. 4 charges. Any single one was enough to ensure he spent the rest of his life behind bars. His lawyer attempted a mitigation defense, arguing that he had been coerced by Meng Xianting and Gu Jingchuan, but never produced a single piece of evidence of coercion, no threatening emails, no transfer records, no material to prove that he had been forced rather than a willing participant in the conspiracy. Song Huijin's final statement to the court was 3 words: "I am sorry." He didn't look up when he said them. The sound was very small, like a wisp of breath squeezed out from the bottom of his throat. Someone in the gallery was crying. His mother, sitting in the very last row, her hair completely white. From opening statements to adjournment, she hadn't spoken a single word, only constantly dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Gu Zhangjun sat in the first row of the gallery, wearing a white button-down shirt, the cuff buttons fastened neatly. The seat next to him was empty. On it sat a canvas bag. Inside the bag was a white coat, folded with precision. Embroidered on the chest was the insignia of Shanghai First People's Hospital, and a line of small blue lettering: Gu Zhangjun Cardiac Surgery. This was the very coat he had been forced to turn in when his license was revoked 5 years ago. 2 days earlier, the hospital's HR department had delivered it back to him, saying his medical license had been reinstated, and he was welcome to return to work anytime. When he took the coat, he ran his fingers over that line of blue lettering on the chest. The stitching was still intact, no loose threads. The color had faded a little, but every character was still clear. After the trial ended, he walked out of the courthouse. At the bottom of the steps stood a teenager in a school uniform, tall and skinny, earbuds hanging around his neck, holding an insulated food container. It was Zhao Changhe's son, Zhao Xiaoyang. 5 years ago he'd been in 7th grade, shorter than his mom. Now he was in his final year of high school, half a head taller than Gu Zhangjun. His mother, Zhang Xiaoa, stood under a sycamore tree in the distance, watching them but not approaching. Zhao Xiaoyang pressed the food container into Gu Zhangjuan's hands, saying it was his mom's red braised pork, made with the best cut of pork belly, simmered in a clay pot for over an hour. His mom said Dr. Gu was too thin, he needed to eat more. Then he pulled an envelope from the pocket of his uniform. Inside was an acceptance letter to the 8-year clinical medicine program at Shanghai Jiaotong University School of Medicine. He said, "Dr. Gu, I got into Jiaotong Medical School. I want to be a surgeon like you." Gu Zhangjun read the letter from beginning to end, closed it, and placed it back in the envelope. Then he took from the pocket of his white coat that blue ballpoint pen he'd used for nearly a decade. The words Shanghai First People's Hospital, printed on the barrel, the cap worn and faded. He placed the pen in the boy's palm. "Use this to write your prescriptions someday." The boy took the pen and held it in his hand. His eyes reddened. He fought hard not to cry, nodded firmly, turned and ran back to his mother. After a few strides he stopped and turned back to shout, "Dr. Gu! My dad said you're a good man. He said he never blamed you." The wind outside the courthouse was strong. The boy's uniform billowed like a sail. Zhang Xiaoa, still standing in the distance, bowed once in Gu Zhengjuan's direction, then took her son's hand and turned to leave. Their silhouettes vanished around the street corner, swallowed by the shadows of the sycamores and the stream of the evening commute. Meng Xianting, after the fallout at the academician review, was admitted to the cardiology ICU at Peking Union Medical College Hospital. The investigation team's conclusions were announced 2 months later. Systemic data fraud, academic misconduct, expropriation of student work, conflict of interest trading. All of it confirmed. His title of academician of the Academy of Engineering was revoked. All positions in the Chinese Medical Association were terminated. All his papers were audited. Several dozen were retracted, and several dozen more were flagged with an expression of concern. The Lancet retracted 3 papers on which Meng Xianting had been corresponding author, and in a rare move, the retraction notice stated, "The journal deeply regrets failing to detect the data fabrication in these papers earlier, and extends its apologies to all researchers and patients affected." When Meng Xianting heard this news in the ICU, he didn't speak. He just closed his eyes. His attending physician was a young woman in her 30s, Dr. Wang, who had once attended his lectures at PUMC. On her rounds every day, she would flip through his monitor records with a completely neutral expression, make notes in her book, close the chart, and turn to the next bed. One evening, his heart rate suddenly spiked. She pushed the medication and the rate slowly came back down. He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. She put away her stethoscope. "Dr. Meng, those 3 words should be said to Gu Zhengjun. Not to me." Then she turned and walked out of the ward, the sound of her rubber-soled shoes receding down the hall. Gu Zhengjun didn't go to see him. He sent someone to deliver a single item to Meng Xianting, that blue ballpoint pen from the Starbucks, the one with Shanghai First People's Hospital printed on it. He had written a single line on a sticky note, folded it into a tiny square, and stuffed it inside the cap of the pen. No one knew what Meng Xianting's reaction was when he saw it. 3 days later he died in the ICU of acute heart failure. The cause of death was listed as acute heart failure. In the precipitating factor column was written emotional agitation. The death certificate was signed by Dr. Wang. She used a regular black gel pen, the kind you buy for 3 yuan at the stationery shop at the hospital gate. Not a gift from a mentor. Not anyone's heirloom. Meng Xianting's funeral was held on a rainy day, in the smallest farewell hall of the funeral home. The number of attendees could be counted on one hand. Almost no one from the academic world came. Gu Zhengjun didn't go. That day, he had a complex coronary artery bypass surgery. The patient was around the same age as Meng Xianting, also with myocardial infarction and multivessel disease. The surgery was a complete success. He was washing his hands after the operation when his phone buzzed. A message from Lu Qingyan. Meng Xianting's funeral was today. Very few people came. He dried his hands and replied with 2 words, "I know." He put away his phone, put on his jacket and walked out of the locker room. At the end of the hall outside the window the rain was coming down hard. Water streamed down the glass, blurring the camphor tree into a green smudge. He stood there for a moment watching the rain, then turned and headed for the outpatient lobby. An old farmer from Guizhou was crouched next to the registration window, gnawing on a steamed bun. His crouch was exactly the same as the one Gu Zhengjun remembered from Laofeng. Weight on the heels, knees splayed out, the posture of someone who'd done manual labor their whole life. The old man looked up, saw Gu Zhengjun in his white coat, and instinctively shuffled inward to make room. Gu Zhengjun crouched down and asked what he was here to see the doctor for. The old farmer said his liver was bad. The county hospital said it was cirrhosis, told him to come to a big hospital, but he hadn't been able to get a registration number, had been waiting for 2 days. His wife was asleep on the bench nearby, an old padded jacket draped over her, lips cracked, hair a mess. Gu Zhengjun pulled a prescription pad from his white coat pocket, wrote a few words on it balanced against his knee, tore the sheet off and handed it to him. Come to the hepatobiliary surgery clinic on the 3rd floor tomorrow morning. Go straight to this room. You don't need to register. The old farmer took the slip of paper. His hands were as rough as old tree bark, his fingernails caked with dirt that would never wash out. He looked down at the flimsy paper in his hand, at the doctor's scrawl that was messy but every character still legible. He folded it carefully in half and tucked it into his pocket, fastening the pocket flap shut, then nodded vigorously. Gu Zhengjun bought a carton of milk and a roll of bread from the vending machine and set it on the chair beside the old farmer, then turned and walked into the elevator. The elevator doors closed, shutting out the noise of the outpatient hall. The polished stainless steel of the doors reflected his face, himself in a white coat, an image that overlapped with the last glimpse he'd had in the elevator 5 years ago when he left the hospital. The difference was 5 years ago, the gaze in that man's eyes had been shattered. Now the gaze in this man's eyes was whole. Back in his office, Lu Jia pushed her wheelchair in. On her lap was a small whiteboard. She just finished a rehab session. Picking up a marker with her left hand, she wrote on the board. I heard you waived the registration fee for a patient from Guizhou today. The characters were crooked, some strokes written the wrong way, but each one was large and forceful. Gu Zhengjun said. I saw that man crouching there gnawing on a steamed bun, and it made me think of myself in that urban village burning up with fever. Lao Feng jimmied my lock and carried me to the clinic. Later I tried to find Lao Feng, but he'd gone back to his hometown in Guizhou, and his phone number stopped working. Lu Jia listened, then erased the board and wrote again. So you are paying back a debt? Gu Zhengjun said. Not really. It's just a registration fee. Lu Jia erased it and wrote again. You know I'm not talking about the registration fee. Gu Zhengjun was silent. Lu Jia wrote another line. Each character so large it nearly filled the whole board. You don't owe anyone anything. You are the person who was robbed of 5 years. Gu Zhengjun stared at that line for a long time. He didn't refute it, didn't nod. He just said very softly, Thank you. Lu Jia put the marker down. The motor of her wheelchair gave a faint hum as she backed out of the office, leaving him alone in the halo of the desk lamp. The rain outside the window had stopped at some point without him noticing. A crack split the clouds and moonlight spilled through, scattering across the glass curtain wall of the inpatient building. He opened his laptop and continued writing the Shenong System Global Multicenter Clinical Trial Protocol. The sound of the keyboard was crisp and rhythmic in the quiet office, like the steady waveform of a heartbeat finally settling down on a monitor. After finishing the several dozen pages of the protocol, he closed the laptop. He picked up the rust-scarred scalpel from the desk. This scalpel had been with him for 5 years, fished out of the hospital dumpster and hidden under the bed in the tin shack, brought to the lab 3 kilometers underground in Cape Town, and carried back from Cape Town to Shanghai. It was no longer needed as evidence now. He walked over to the deepest drawer in the office, crouched down, opened it, placed the scalpel inside, closed the drawer and locked it. The sound of the key turning in the lock was very soft, like a sigh finally settling to the ground. At the end of the hall, the red light above the operating room doors was glowing, a sign that the surgery inside was still in progress. Life was being saved. His footsteps faltered as he passed that lead-lined door. Through it, he could just make out the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the steady hum of the suction machine. These sounds were like the opening bars of an old song, carved into the deepest part of his life. He listened for a moment, then kept walking. The door closed silently behind him. The red light stayed on like a heart that would never stop beating. The next morning, Gu Zhengjun arrived at the hospital at 7:30. He changed into surgical scrubs, put on a surgical cap and mask, and walked into operating room 3. The surgical light blazed on, illuminating the table down to the last detail. The scrub nurse handed him the scalpel, and he took it in his hand. The temperature of the handle merged with his palm, not the cold that takes a moment to adjust to, but a temperature that was right from the very start, as if the knife had been waiting for him for 5 years. He glanced down at the cutting edge, bright as a mirror. No rust, no dark red spots, only the surgical light reflecting a small, bright image on the surface of the blade. He made the first incision. The movement was clean and crisp, without a single wasted tremor. The blade traced the pre-marked incision line smoothly through the skin, like a pen drawing a precise line on paper. Inside the OR, there was only the beeping of the monitor, the soft clink of instruments, and his own voice giving instructions, steady and free of any tremor. The anesthesiologist called out vitals. Every reading was normal. The scrub nurse handed him each instrument at the perfect moment, with a rhythm that felt like a dance that needed no rehearsal. Someone looked in through the glass wall of the observation room, then turned and said something to the person beside them. The voice was thick with barely suppressed emotion. "Dr. Gu is back." The hallway was filled with people. Nurses from the nursing station, doctors from anesthesiology, colleagues who'd rushed over from neighboring ORs when they heard the news, and even a few patients' family members in hospital gowns who didn't know what was happening but had followed the crowd to look. Lin Xiaoyu stood at the very front, her mask still not removed, her eyes already red. After that surgery back then, she'd been transferred to the outpatient dressing room, doing wound care for 3 years. The very first thing Gu Zhengjun did after his reinstatement was to bring her back to the OR. She had said that the person she felt most sorry for in her entire life was Dr. Gu. Gu Zhengjun told her, "You don't owe me anything. You just didn't see that blade." She said, "I saw it. I saw it, but I didn't dare say anything." Gu Zhengjun said, "Do you dare now?" She said, "I do." Lu Jie's wheelchair was parked outside the observation room. She watched the surgery and progressed through the glass. She had injured her lumbar spine in that accident. But before it happened, she had been one of the best scrub nurses in the entire hospital, her hands steady as a machine. She watched Gu Zhengjun place the final suture, throw the knot, cut the thread. Then she picked up her whiteboard marker and wrote a line, holding it up for the head nurse beside her to see. The head nurse read it, patted her shoulder and said, "You're right. He never really left." The line on the whiteboard was, "He's still so fast. Faster than before." Gu Zhengjun peeled off his gloves and mask and pushed open the OR doors. The hallway outside was packed with people. No one applauded. Hospital regulations prohibited noise outside the OR. But in every pair of eyes there was a standing ovation. He moved through the crowd, his pace neither fast nor slow, the hem of his white coat swaying gently with his steps. He walked into the changing room, picked up his phone and saw a message from Lu Qingyan. The Defu Liver Regeneration Research Center officially opened today. Zhang Xiuwa is the foundation's first full-time employee. Zhao Xiaoyang got his admission letter framed. The rust from that scalpel has been photographed and archived in the evidence room. Lao Feng's hardware store opened for business today. The name is Zhengjun Hardware. He told me to ask you if he wrote the characters right. He finished reading the message. He put the phone back in his pocket, and in front of the changing room mirror, he adjusted the collar of his white coat. The person in the mirror wore a white coat with that line of blue lettering embroidered on the chest. Gu Zhengjun cardiac surgery. The color had faded a little, but every single character was still perfectly clear. He pushed the door open and walked into the hall. The crowd had already dispersed, everyone back to their posts. The call bell at the nursing station was ringing. The anesthesiology department was in their morning meeting. The registration windows in the outpatient lobby had long lines. The hospital was running as usual, like a vast machine, every component working steadily in its place. He walked toward the elevators and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. As the elevator doors closed, he pulled an object from his pocket, a 50-cent coin. He tossed it into the air and caught it. This time he didn't look to see whether it was heads or tails. He simply put the coin back in his pocket. He no longer needed to flip a coin. He already knew exactly where he was going.